When we're burnt out, that emotional tank is stuffed to the brim with resentment or anxiety or dread, and it's cracking and it's leaking. We've got to create space in ourselves for our emotions to flow in and out without reacting, without exploding.
Hi, friends, and welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Podcast listeners, we are back with another episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast. And I know you've heard me say it before, but I'm grateful to have you here. We have a great show on deck for you today. So let me start with asking you this question. So as you're sitting there or walking around your house, cleaning the kitchen, whatever it is you're doing right now, driving to work, driving the kids to soccer, have you ever felt that sort of I cannot keep up this pace feeling? Have you ever felt like, one more thing and I'm going to lose it? Or if one more, challenge lands on my plate, I'm going to blow. If you can resonate or relate to that at all, and I know that I can, this episode is for you. We're going to start by saying, listen, if you have felt that, there's zero shame. And there is something you can do about it. And that's really what today's guest is going to talk about. So I am so very pleased to introduce you to today's guest, Marissa McCool. Marissa is known as the public health burnout coach, or just the burnout coach. She is a renowned coach, speaker, and advocate with a mission to help female leaders and mid-career professionals alleviate their persistent work stress and double their free time to achieve more work-life balance. With over 15 years of public health leadership experience and a personal journey overcoming burnout, Marissa empowers women to thrive while prioritizing self-care. Marissa's coaching approach blends evidence-based strategies with feminist coaching principles and personal insights, aiming to eliminate the epidemic of burnout in public health and beyond. She teaches women how to set boundaries, reclaim control over their schedule, navigate work-life dynamics, and prioritize rest and self-care without compromising their career aspirations. Her clients experience profound transformations, achieving professional milestones like promotions, significant salary increases, and most importantly, improved well-being. Before I sort of dive in and introduce you to Marissa, I want you to know that if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't work in public health, doesn't matter, Marissa can help you. The work that she does in this burnout space, as you're about to hear, transcends any particular career or field. And I think as you will hear, Marissa and I are speaking the same language. And you might resonate or be like, wow, where have I heard that before? Yeah, it's because this is something you've heard us talk about or heard me talk about. And I love the framework and the conciseness that Marissa brings to this issue, the perspective, the reframes, I really think this is an awesome conversation. And it's one that so many of us need to hear. So thrilled to introduce you today to my guest, Marissa McCool. All right, welcome to the podcast. I am so excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and talk about burnout, even though that's not the most fun topic. It is my passion, so I'm happy to talk about it.
So, Marissa, I want to start by diving into what might be an obvious question, but how did this become your area of passion? Because you said for most people, this might not be the most fun to think about or talk about, or certainly to experience.
Yeah. So my story, how I got into this was I ended up burnt out. So I've spent my whole career in public health. Public health is a helping profession. So it's not quite like doctors and nurses, although it is aligned with that. We do kind of work at the health departments or do the research. I think most people know public health from COVID, but people who go into public health are doing it because they care, because they want to help. It's, disproportionately women who are in the field. And it's also a field riddled with challenges, lack of funding, lack of staffing, right? Talk about compassion fatigue, similar to
Yeah.
teachers and social workers. In 2017, I had this confluence of my work stress, and then my mom became suddenly very ill overnight, and I became her full-time caretaker. And I was going through a breakup. So I had all these external stressors at once that I was trying to navigate, and I ended up burnt out. But I didn't know it was burnout. Like, I had no idea that's what it was until later. And I got out of it, and I could look back and be like, oh, yeah, I was burnt out. That's what that was. And the tools I learned to get out of it, I've used to prevent it from coming back. And when COVID hit, I saw a lot of my colleagues, a lot of the people around me needing these tools. So I started kind of helping others and providing some resources and coaching and skills and knowledge and strategies for managing burnout.
As you were mentioning some of the challenges in the public health field specifically, I didn't even realize that you were talking about them like pre-COVID right? And post-COVID, I mean, I think we were seeing public health people burn out left, right, and center, not just because of the COVID, you know, issue itself, but then all the misinformation and disinformation and the sort of the vilifying in some cases of people that were there to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I always say, I kind of joke, it's not funny, but I always say I burnt out before it was cool, right? Before people talked about it, before, there was a spotlight on it. And in some ways, like COVID has really brought the spotlight on it, not just for people who work, but for parents. Talk about 2020 trying to do Zoom school and manage all of that. So it's brought this issue that already existed for so many to the surface. And that's a good thing. So we can talk about it and we can do something about it.
Yeah, I love that you say that because sometimes when we think of things coming to the surface, we're like, oh, that makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to deal with that. But burnout, like anything else, we can't address it if we're not willing to dig in and talk about it.
Yeah.
So let's sort of talk about, you mentioned that you learned some skills. Once you kind of figured out what had been going on, you developed some skills around how to manage that, and then you use those skills to support parents and professionals in their own space of burnout. I want to dig into those, but maybe actually a better sort of preamble to that is, can we talk about what burnout actually is and what are the symptoms of it? How do I know if I'm experiencing burnout or I'm just tired?
Yeah, I think that's so important because so many people I meet with, they don't realize they're experiencing burnout. And that's because it's not quite like going to the doctor and getting a CAT scan and then getting a result, right? Burnout, I like to talk about as it's a spectrum of experiences. And that means the way you might be experiencing burnout might be different than your partner, than a friend. The way you might be experiencing burnout now might be different than that 2020 Zoom school, trying to work, navigate this pandemic thing. So it's important to note that this is spectrum and it kind of can change depending on what you're navigating. But there are some things you can look at and kind of assess, okay, could these be indicators that I'm going through burnout? So one big one is kind of physical health. Sleep is a huge indicator of chronic stress. Chronic stress is something that if you get stuck in for long enough, it can turn into burnout. So that can look like struggle falling asleep or getting quality sleep. Now, we also want to couch this in the context of our lives.
I'm laughing because I'm like, oh my God, are you talking to me or are you talking to my audience right now?
We could do a whole assessment here and let you know. Just kidding. But, it does matter the context of your lives. If you just had a newborn baby, right, you're not going to be sleeping very much. So that's the context, right? It might not quite be burnout like we're talking about it. So there is some nuance here, but sleep is a big one. Autoimmune flare-ups. For me, my psoriasis was flaring. I've had clients who their hair loss or eczema, right? Digestive issues, having a lot of digestive issues, IBS, chronic constipation, a lot of physical health indicators. Actually, about 50% of adult US doctor visits can be traced back to stress-related issues. And
Wow.
8% of the national US healthcare spending can be tied to burnout of some form. So the physical health is actually a pretty big indicator.
So wait, okay, I want to break that down a little bit further. So 50% of visits outside of like your well person check, I
Mhm.
assume, like are somehow related to burnout,
Stress.
to
Yeah.
stress,
Yeah.
which stress can lead to burnout.
Yeah. And we do have to remember chronic stress and burnout, although they overlap, they're slightly different. So, chronic stress is when you're experiencing stress for a long period of time and you're not really moving out of it, but eventually you can or you do. Burnout comes from being stuck in chronic stress for a really long time where you're just stuck there, right? Your tank is empty.
Okay.
So they are related and actually a really good, like if you're experiencing a lot of stress and it's ongoing, you're probably on the road to burnout, right? That's a really good, because most people know when they're experiencing stress
Right.
more than they know when they're burnt out. So if you feel like you're experiencing stress a lot, the majority of the days, of weeks, that's a good clue you're probably on the road to burnout if you don't address it.
Okay. So stress, like, so it's sort of almost like a continuum
Yeah.
where we have chronic stress that can come from a number of sources, which we can
Yeah.
talk about.
Yeah.
And then if that lasts too long and we aren't able to get ourselves out, we reach a point of burnout.
Yeah.
How do we know where we are on that continuum?
Yeah. So a couple indicators that I see frequently when people get to burnout. One is really the mental and emotional indicators, right? So it is very normal as humans to have a mix of emotions, to feel some anxiety, some resentment, some dread day to day, but also to feel happy, content, gratitude, right? Typically, though, when you're burnt out, you are stuck in those negative emotions. Like you're only feeling dread or anger or resentment all day, most weeks, right? You're stuck in that. That's your kind of like whole experience. The other kind of indicator I see a lot is this change in our relationship with ourselves. So, kind of losing interest in things we used to have a lot of interest in. Maybe you have
Mm,
lost interest in spending time with your friends, or taking that bubble bath, or reading your fantasy novels. Again, we want to couch this in the season of our life. If your kids are in that season where you're like driving them to a million activities, maybe it makes sense you're not going to ceramics.
right.
But if you're checked out of everything that has brought you joy or that you used to engage in and you're kind of feeling a little apathetic or just so exhausted you can't engage, that's probably a good indicator you're right around the burnout area.
Okay. So it's not, yeah, I appreciate that you're saying we have to pay attention to the context, just like when you have a newborn baby, you didn't sleep, right? I
Yeah.
remember those days vaguely. Thank God they're not here anymore. So, if we're looking at issues that are coming up in a context that doesn't explain them,
Yeah.
right, then there's reason for concern.
Yeah. And with the physical health stuff, obviously there's other things that affect physical health. So you can check out with your doctor and like check on all those things, right? And there can be multiple things that contribute to it. But just as an example, one of the women I worked with recently, she has like a Garmin watch. She's a runner,
Hmm.
and they track your sleep. And it went from a rating of a consistent poor to a consistent excellent, just from kind of reducing her stress and burnout.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. I was actually talking with my coach, my business coach, last week. And at the time that we're recording this, the US election was last week.
Yeah.
And she said, I thought I was handling all the stress of it pretty well. And then she looked at her aura ring
Oh, yeah.
and the trackers on there. And she said, oh, my stress score was through the roof. And suddenly realized I wasn't managing quite as well as I
Yeah.
thought I was.
Yeah, absolutely. There are things that you can track those things with, which
Yeah.
is just the day and age we live in. It's so fascinating.
It is so fascinating. And I have to assume that, if you get a spike on a particularly stressful day, that's not necessarily something to worry about. It's when we're seeing that over and over.
Yes, we all experience stress. Like that is a human experience, right? But having the ability to move ourselves through it and out of it and kind of let it go and move forward, that is a skill that we have to develop, especially today where there's a lot of external stressors and a lot of things happening outside of us that might create a lot of stress that we're having to navigate or barriers or challenges in our way.
Yeah. Yes. So let's talk about those a little bit. And I know I started all of this with I want to get to what the skills are that we need to know, but I do think there's a lot to sort of dig into before we get there. So hang tight, people. We'll get there. Before we hit record today, you and I were talking a little bit kind of about the state of parenting right now. And you mentioned that, a good majority of your clients are parents
Yeah.
who are dealing with parenting and, whatever else might be in the, you know, in the roles that we play, and they're in a space of burnout. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the unique, or I don't know, unprecedented space that we're seeing parents in right now?
Yeah, so I know you mentioned before in your podcast about the US Surgeon General's kind of advisory, and I just want to put that in context for everyone listening, right? The US Surgeon General is like the top public health leader. So from a public health perspective, someone who spent her career in public health, the US Surgeon General, what they put out in their reports is basically the top concern of the nation. So when we look back in history, some of the big milestones the US Surgeon General put out were things like smoking can cause cancer, drunk driving is a crisis, is an epidemic, right? Things of that nature that now we see as health issues. And as you know, they put out a recent advisory about the state of stress in parenting. So from a public health perspective, that is a huge deal that it's gotten to that level. It's that big of a problem that the US Surgeon General has said, hey, this is a big enough public health issue across the nation that we need to make sure we're prioritizing it. And there's a lot of factors that play into that. Part of it is kind of some external challenges, right? We don't have a national paid parental leave policy. Childcare costs are skyrocketing everywhere, alongside the inflation of everything else, right? Food, bills, all of that. We can talk culturally how a lot of families are now living in spaces where they don't have extended family to help them raise their kids, right? We can talk about the stress of school shootings, right? Social media. There's so many external factors that are making parenting so stressful and increasing burnout among parents.
For sure. And, just as you're seeing this in your practice, like I'm seeing it too, where parents are like, this is so hard. And it almost sometimes makes parents unable to manage even some of the tiny stuff that if they weren't burned out, they weren't so stressed, they weren't in a state of kind of constant crisis, those little things would be so much more manageable. And suddenly they just aren't feeling that way. And then you and I had also talked about this before we hit record today, which is we're also seeing a lot of parents who are not just dealing with parenting, right? That's not the only caregiver role that they might be playing. They also, in many cases, have aging and ailing parents, which you described for
Yeah.
yourself. Add a outside of the home job onto all of that, and you've got, I mean, it seems to me kind of a recipe for chronic stress
Yeah.
at a minimum.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just think about in the context of a working parent, right? You might have a job where you get paid sick leave. But is that just for your sick leave, or what about when your kiddos are sick? Well, what about if you're taking care of your mom who just fell and broke her hip? Right? We have policies like the Family Medical Leave Act. Well, that doesn't guarantee pay, right?
Right.
So there's all of these challenges of how to navigate these life experiences that when we look at external challenges, some of the norms, some of the culture, some of the policies and practices aren't really set up to support parents in thriving.
Yeah. Which is so, like, as somebody who works in that parenting space, that's so frustrating to me. I can't even tell you. And I don't see any magical fix coming down the pike in the next decade, probably,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I would love that if this was prioritized, but if we work on the assumption that it's not going to be prioritized by, leadership, we have to figure out what to do about it. And I know that's where you come in. So let's talk a little bit about what to do if you feel, well, I mean, I guess we can even start with just that chronic stress piece. What are the skills that we can use to maybe avoid getting to the point of burnout? And coupled with that, once we are in burnout, what do we do?
Yeah. So I like to couch this in a specific framework because there's really kind of two roots of burnout. One we've already talked about, which is the external causes of burnout, right? Those external things, other people, their behavior, policies, norms. Those are things we can't change or necessarily control. But then there's this internal root of burnout that is where we have more agency and control. And that's where, we're not saying no and we're not setting boundaries. Maybe it's because we feel guilty, right? But there are decisions we're making that might make it harder for ourselves. We
Yeah.
might be getting stuck in compare and despair and thinking we have to do everything perfectly and have a perfectly clean home. And so then we're really hard on ourselves, right? Those internal pieces, we have more agency and control to change our decisions and our behaviors. So even in the face of those external challenges, we can make some even small but mighty impactful behavior changes to help ourselves reduce our stress.
As I'm listening to you talk, I'm like, yes, that makes sense. And
Mm.
I'm imagining, because this is what happens in my own head, is I can imagine what some of the moms listening to this are thinking. And they're like, yeah, that sounds nice for everybody else.
Mhm.
But for my home, it needs to be, it needs to look like this, or my kids need to be doing da 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 da, all the activities or all the things. So when you encounter someone who's, needs to get out of the chronic stress, but doesn't know where to start or is afraid of some, and I think maybe afraid is the right word. Like that sounds like a strange word to use here, but I think it might be the right one. Afraid to let some things go. Because
Mhm.
when we let things go, then we feel like we've lost control, right? Talk me through that. Like, how do we get people started?
Yeah. So this is about kind of like changing your focus of where you're focusing, right? So if we're looking at it as like, well, my kids need to do all these activities for their well-being so that they develop into, healthy, whole young adults, and I need to have a clean home. And right, when we focus there, it does feel like a loss when we start to say no and set boundaries.
Hmm.
But we got to shift our focus a little bit, right? If we start to shift in, okay, how is the way we're operating now actually not helping us, not healthy?
Yeah.
One of the big things I see is that when we're overloaded and we are stressed and we are not saying no and not setting boundaries, not doing the things we do have agency over, right? That's when we start to be reactive to our partner, to our kids.
Yep.
We're not working through conflict in a healthy way. We're being short, we're being impatient, right? And so when we think about, oh, if I start to shift some of my decisions to say no and set boundaries, it will help me be more responsive and less reactive. It'll help me be more patient and more present. You actually see that you're gaining a lot more than you're losing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's so interesting to hear you sort of put it in that framework, because I talk a lot in parenting about the need to move from reactivity into responsiveness.
No,
That's not an easy thing
no,
to do, right?
no.
Because most of us weren't taught those great coping skills or great stress management, self-regulation, right? And then you add in all the stresses and pressures that you've been talking about, and it sometimes feels like a little bit of a pressure cooker for people. So when talking with someone, one of your clients or one of the moms listening to this right now who's thinking, oh, this sounds familiar, this resonates with me, and they're saying, okay, I get you, right, Marissa, I get you, I hear you saying that I can gain more if I let some things go than what I'm losing,
Mm,
but I don't know where to start.
mm, yeah, which is very common. And I want to be clear, this is not an overnight. And also, this is like ongoing, which I know a lot of people don't want to hear, right?
Yeah.
This is an ongoing process, an ongoing thing we have to constantly do. There's not like an end of the rainbow, utopia, enlightenment where everything's perfect. So I think we have to first start by accepting that, like it will take time, right?
Yeah.
The other thing I want to mention is to many people's disappointment, including myself, who's very type A, it's not a fancy checklist that you can just go through and get that dopamine hit and feel really good, right? That was something I had to come to terms with. I tried to chase a checklist to get out of my burnout and to feel better, and that
Yeah.
just created more burnout. And it's actually a lot less dopamine chasing in that way. So
Mhm.
the first place that I think most people need to start is actually with processing their emotions in a healthy way, which is, again, not sexy. It doesn't sound fun. It's not something that's going to be like, the top box movie topic necessarily. But that's
Right.
really how it has to start. Because when we talk about being reactive versus responsive, when we're being reactive, it's because we haven't processed our emotions. So I like to use a visual metaphor. So I want you to imagine that everyone has an emotional tank inside of them where
Okay.
it stores our emotions. When we are able to be responsive, when we are not stuck in burnout or chronic stress, our tank is maybe half full, right? And it's half full with a mix of emotions. Yeah, some anxiety, some resentment, but there's some contentment and gratitude and other things. And it's half full because then when stressors externally come up, like let's say it's Tuesday night at 8 p.m. and your kid says, "Hey, I need cupcakes tomorrow for my class. Forgot to tell you," right? You have space for that a little annoyance or irritation. It can get a little higher, right? But there's space for
Yeah.
it to move in and out and space to have some compassion and respond to your kiddo.
Hmm. Hmm.
Where when we're burnt out, that emotional tank is stuffed to the brim with resentment or anxiety or dread, and it's cracking and it's leaking. So when our kid comes to us and says, "Hey, I need cupcakes tomorrow," instead of having space for your irritation to go anywhere, it explodes onto them. And you might yell, or you might get defensive or
Yeah.
shut down, right? And so the emotion piece is so important because we got to create space in ourselves for our emotions to flow in and out without reacting, without exploding. And
Yeah.
so to do that, a lot of people talk about like, oh, meditation or therapy or EFT tapping, which are all great, all things I participate in, all things I have my clients do. But for those who are listening who might feel overwhelmed by that, we can start a lot smaller. It actually starts with, I mean, it takes 30 seconds, 3 minutes, very short, doing a body scan, head to toe. What am I feeling in my body? Because emotions live in our body. They don't live in our brain, they live in our body. Am I hot in my chest? Am I sweaty in my hands? Am I tingling in my legs? And then name the emotion. A lot of times we use the word stress as an emotion. It's not an emotion. So when I have women do this with me, they'll say, "Oh, I'm angry." And I say, "Okay, let's just do the body scan real quick. Take 30 seconds." And they
Yeah.
do it. And when I say, "What's the emotion you're feeling?" What they realize is they're actually feeling sad or lonely or isolated or envious, right? There's something under there. And research has shown over and over again, when you do this and you go through this process, it actually reduces the intensity of the emotion and it helps you distance yourself from it. So
Hmm.
going back to that tank analogy, you kind of reduce the pressure on the tank. And the more you do this, the more you reduce that pressure and create more space for yourself.
Yeah. What you are saying is so resonating with me on a couple of different levels. One, it's so funny that that you use the tank analogy, because in my membership community, I've got a worksheet where there's a picture of like a bomb,
Mm.
right? And you can put your emotions, and then all, one, you can't shove one more in there because it's gonna,
Yes.
right, it's gonna go over. But also from a more personal level, just the other night, my teenager, who I actually have a really positive relationship with, had done something kind of dickish. And she's awesome. And she'd just been kind of thoughtless in something that she did. And it hurt my feelings. And I was snappy and, upset about it. And my husband looked at me and he's like, "Why are you so angry right now?" Right. The assumption that he had was that it was anger. And I sat with that for a second. I was like, "I'm not angry. I'm not angry. I'm hurt." To take that moment to kind of sit with where I was emotionally, it wasn't that like hurt felt better than angry or angry felt better. They both would suck, right? And in the moment, it sucked, but it did kind of crack something open a little bit for me, and also for my husband, who was like, "Oh, that makes so much more sense now," right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So anyway, I'm right there with you. Everything you're saying is completely ringing
Yeah.
true.
And when you do that, the other thing is then you can respond to that emotion, right? When we think we're angry and we're trying to respond to anger, but we're really hurt or really sad, it's not going to work,
Yeah.
right? Whether we're trying to like have a conversation with our kid or a partner or make a decision or take an action, right? When we get that clarity of what's really going on with us, we also have room to have kind of some guidance and direction. Okay, what do we want to do about this?
Yeah.
Maybe maybe yelling isn't what I want to do. Maybe I want to have a conversation and be vulnerable and share how I'm feeling, and that creates more connection.
Yeah.
So sometimes, and this is often what I recommend to people, is like sometimes you got to give yourself a timeout, and not in a disciplinary way. Think about it
Right.
more in a sports way, right? In
Yep.
sports, you take a timeout because you got to regroup. You got to get the game plan going. You got to check in. It's kind of more like that. Like give yourself a
Yeah.
little timeout, check in with yourself, do a body scan. What am I feeling? And then decide, what do I want to do with this? Maybe I don't want to have this conversation until tomorrow. Maybe I want to let this go. Maybe I want to say no, right? You have a little bit more space for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you take the space, as you said, that puts you into a position of responsiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rather than that reactivity. You talked about the timeout and sort of the body scan, which I think are just brilliant tools that are available to us, whether we're in chronic stress, burnout, or
Yeah.
just parenting on a daily basis. What role does rest? And by rest, I don't mean sleep.
Yeah.
Sleep's good, as you've already said, it's really important. But what role does rest play in all of this? And for those of us, as you already said, you're a type A, for those of us who are also similarly kind of along those type A lines, why does rest feel hard?
Okay. This is like my bread and butter here.
Okay,
Um,
love it.
so, we are taught that rest is just sleeping or going on vacation or going to get a massage, which those things can be restful, but they also aren't sometimes. Like, how many times do you get back from vacation and you feel more exhausted, or you're
Yeah,
getting
like
yeah,
I need a vacation from my vacation.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Or you're like getting a massage and you're just thinking about like all the chores and to-do lists and running errands, right? So when we think about rest that way, it's very constrictive. I really like to think about rest as four different categories of rest. There is physiological rest, which you might not have a lot of control over, but that's kind of the internal workings of your brain and body, kind of repairing muscles, consolidating memories. Then there's physical rest, which some people think of as like laying on the couch. It can be. Physical rest just means giving your body what it needs. So maybe it is a stretch after sitting at your desk all day or going for a walk, right? Then what I think most people need is the mental and emotional rest, right? Because if we are getting a massage, but our mental load is just going, you're not going to feel rested.
Yeah.
If we're on vacation, but we're stewing in anger, we're not going to feel rested, right? So really that's the type of rest we need, is to be able to process our emotions and have space for them to let go. And we need to have kind of not quiet, because I think I haven't met anyone whose brain can just be quiet for long periods of time, right? But a reduction in the mental load, in self-criticism, in self-judgment, and putting ourselves down, right?
Mhm.
That's really the piece of it. And part of the reason we feel it feels so hard to get rest is because we aren't having the mental and emotional rest, because that little thing called guilt comes up and kind of gets in the way of
Yeah.
experiencing it.
Yeah. So when guilt gets in the way, and man, if anybody knows guilt, it's a mom,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a mom or a dad. We can recognize that, but what do we do about it? And how do we step more heartfully into that mental and emotional rest and sort of ditch the guilt or let it,
Yeah.
see itself out the door?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of two phases. The first is we have to kind of recognize that guilt doesn't mean anything. I think a lot of times we are taught and we think if guilt comes up, it must mean we're doing something wrong, or it's like some indicator we shouldn't do this. That's
Mm,
not true, right? The reason we feel guilty for taking time for ourselves is largely because maybe the messages received as a kid, how society has socialized us, right? A lot of things outside of us that aren't necessarily quote unquote true that we've internalized as true. So I think first we have to recognize that guilt doesn't necessarily mean anything. It might just be habitual. It might just be learned from our parents.
yeah.
So we don't have to take it as true. And if we don't have to take it as true, we don't have to do what it says, right?
Mm,
Guilt doesn't have to be in charge. I often
yeah.
talk about it as like you can either let guilt drive the car, or you can drive the car and guilt can just buckle up in the back seat,
Yep.
right? It can be there. You can still go where you want to go, but you don't have to let it drive the car.
That is such a powerful framing of just that idea that just because the messaging's coming through doesn't mean it's accurate.
Yeah.
And that's so easy to accept in other contexts, right? Like I can tell you something and you might be like, yeah, that doesn't sound right. I might see something on social media and be like, yeah, that doesn't sound right, right? I'm not going to inherently trust the messaging. But when that little guilt bug steps in and says, "Ooh, you're doing," we tend to, I think, I don't know if this is human nature or cultural influence or what, but we tend to give it like credence and assume that if it's there, it must be telling us something important. And you're
Yeah.
saying, no.
Yeah. No, I mean, not necessarily. And I think a lot of that is because culturally we don't talk about emotions. And if we are taught about emotions, it's like avoid all the negative emotions. They mean something bad.
Yeah.
So we have to kind of counter that. And often I like to think about it as like, imagine that the part of your brain that's like bringing the guilt is a lawyer in a courtroom,
Hmm.
right? They've made their case. The other lawyer hasn't been able to make their case. That lawyer that's coming from the place of guilt, they've had enough speaking time arguing their case, right? We got to shift a little bit and build some evidence that maybe that's not true. So sometimes it's like reframing. So how is it possible that me taking an hour to myself actually won't hurt my kids, but help my kids? How is it possible that me taking a break actually isn't going to be a bad thing and might help my partner, right?
Yeah.
Because when you go through that activity, you actually find there's a lot of positives to you saying no or setting boundaries or getting rest, whatever it may be. And sometimes it can look like, well, I'm modeling this behavior for my kids, so they'll learn that they're important. Or sometimes it can be, oh, well, they're going to have to learn how to problem solve, and that's a really important skill for them.
Yeah.
Or, maybe my partner's going to have to really see firsthand what I juggle all the time, and maybe that will help our relationship, right? We got to kind of reframe how our change in behavior actually, and the guilt that might be arising, might not be a bad thing and might actually end up being a positive thing.
Yeah. I just think that's such an important thing to be able to do and to think about. When I talk with parents, one of the questions I find myself often asking is, for example, if it's a mom of a daughter or a mom of a son, like, what do you want that child to feel when they are an adult in terms of their like inalienable right to take care of themselves? And I have never yet had a parent say to me, "Oh, I hope my kid sacrifices everything for their family and, to the point where they can't do anymore. I hope they just go, 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 go and get everything perfect. I hope their house is perfectly clean. I hope I've never had a parent say that.
Yeah.
If you're listening and you think you'd say that, let me know. But most parents say, "Oh, I want my child to grow up feeling like they have the right to take care of themselves. They deserve to be taken care of." And that goes right into that, like what we're modeling, right? Which you just
Yeah.
talked about, that reframing that we might actually, by taking an hour of rest for ourselves, might be helping our kids feel better 30 years down the road.
Yeah. And we can also ask it in reverse. If your mom had said no more or prioritized herself more, how would that impact you? And like, I know for me, if my mom had actually prioritized her emotional health, I would have much preferred that than running around to a million activities or having a perfectly clean house, right? Because that
Yeah.
meant there'd be less conflict in the home, there'd be more openness, we'd probably have a deeper relationship growing up, right? So I think also we can do it in the reverse of like, okay, if my parent kind of processed their emotions and worked on themselves and prioritized that, yeah, it would have benefited me a lot in my development.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that framing of it, to go both back in time
Yeah.
and forward in time. When you meet with folks who are like, I think I'm burning out, or I'm definitely in chronic stress. You talked about that body scan, like these little tiny steps that we can take. How do we know when we've managed to get ourselves out?
Okay. It will be so obvious. It is. It is. It's interesting because the burnout and chronic stress doesn't feel so obvious. And I think that's partly because everyone is kind of operating from that place typically. So it's like, how do you tell a fish it swims in water?
Hmm.
But what I have found is that when you get out of it and you start to change, you become almost, not in a bad way, the anomaly. And it's very, very obvious, right? You start to notice less conflict at home. Your kids start opening up to you more, right?
Mm.
Your productivity is better. You're less harsh on yourself. People will comment. A lot of times my clients will say, my husband has commented how much happier I seem, right? Or I noticed that I got so much more done today. So it will become actually a lot more obvious once you start moving out of it. I think the trickier thing is recognizing that you're in it and you need to start working on it.
Yeah. Yeah. That it's not, this is not the kind of thing, like most things, that just gets better by ignoring it.
No, actually it gets worse.
Mm.
And I would also say, like, I think, especially in the US culture, there's this like grin and bear it, hustle mentality, burnout badge of honor, right? And this idea that like, oh, once we do it all, there's some like prize at the end of the rainbow. And we have to really dismantle that and see like, actually, no, there is no prize. Like, there's actually a lot of detriment to overworking and being stuck in burnout and chronic stress and being reactive constantly. And I will tell you, all the people I've met with, not one of them would say that when they're 80, they want to look back and think, oh, I wish I had spent more time being reactive and making sure the house is clean and going to every meeting. No, they would say, I wish I'd spent more time with my kids or traveling or being happier.
I think that's such an important point that you make in terms of, sort of like that, what do you want for your kids down the road, but also thinking about when you come to the kind of the end of your own road, like what do you want to look back and think about? You've mentioned throughout our conversation here, some of the impacts of chronic stress and burnout, especially on us. And you've sprinkled in a few things about the impact that it might have on our kids or our partners. But I'd love to talk about that just a little bit more, in terms of the work that you've done. What are some of the bigger impacts that you've seen this, I'm going to call it a public health crisis. I don't know if that's what it really,
Yeah.
counts as, but I think it does have on relationships, because I talk so much about the importance and the value of focusing on relationship with our kids and our partners in our home. How does this impact that?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we talk about like when you're in constant state of chronic stress and you're reacting constantly, that creates a lot of strain in relationships in a couple different ways, right? Can create distance where your partner, your kids don't want to come to you. They're kind of scared of you or avoidant, right? They might start to hide truths from you or not be honest or vulnerable. It can create like difficulty moving through life challenges, right? It can create a lot of isolation. So you don't have a lot of support. Maybe you've isolated yourself from your friends or your support system because you haven't been able to kind of show up for them or you've been reactive when they've needed you, right? So it can kind of create the situation where you end up being an island of one, even if you're surrounded by people
Mm.
because of how the interactions have gone. That's, of course, like worst case scenario, right? But I also like to talk about on the flip side. When we learn how to process our emotions, when we learn how to prevent burnout and chronic stress, we have so much more energy and capacity to be present, to be vulnerable, to connect with other people. And that's really, really important because despite what maybe kind of the American kind of messaging is, humans are social species. We are community species. Nothing is done alone. We need each other, especially when you talk about raising a family or caretaking for anyone in your life. We need that support and that help, whether it's someone to just talk to or go to coffee to or borrow their truck if you're moving or ask for their help getting into kind of a doctor at their hospital they work for, right? So it allows us to build those connections where we can support one another through life's challenges, which is really what we need to thrive. Because if you're all alone, isolated, you're not going to get very far.
Yeah. Yeah, we've all probably at least at one moment or another in our lives felt that, like, the island of one. And you're right, it doesn't feel good. And people who've listened to the podcast before probably heard me say we were never meant to parent alone. We were never meant to do any of this alone.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to a really important point where if you're listening and you find yourself really burnt out, or if you think you are, or like reactive, and you have decided you want to start working on this, as hard as it might be, it is actually really healthy and really important to communicate that with your partner, your kids. Like, hey, I know I've been really stressed. I know I've been taking it out on you. I'm going to work on it, right?
Yeah.
That is part of rebuilding and repairing what may have been cracked, right? Rebuilding some vulnerability, some trust, some connection. And also taking accountability and showing yourself, I can do something about this. I can kind of take ownership and I can change it, right? And as you go through the process, you're not going to be perfect, right? You're going to mess up. That's okay. You can apologize. And you can also have compassion for yourself and give yourself grace. And there's plenty of tools and resources out there to support you. But when you're working on this, don't work on it in isolation either, right? Make sure you communicate to those around you you're working on it. There are resources out there like this podcast, or if you want to go to therapy or hire a coach or something, right? Like we cannot get out of burnout alone either. Like that is a fallacy. We need support.
Yeah. Which is actually a lovely, I mean, it's such an important point and a lovely segue, because I want to ask you, Marissa, how can, if people are listening to this and they're like, wow, this is resonating, I feel it all, and some support would be really helpful. For anyone that's interested in working with you on this issue, what is the best place for people to track you down?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is probably the best place. You can connect with me, Marissa McCool, or my website, mccoolcoaching.com. I'm sure we'll share those links. And, I will say, like, when I went through this, I really had to DIY it for a long time, and it did not work at all. I actually got more frustrated. It wasn't until I reached out for support and worked with a coach and a therapist. And I know that first step is really hard. That's actually the hardest step. I tell people when they come to my consult, if you're here, you're over the biggest hurdle. That is the hardest step of saying, I'm struggling and I need help. So I'm here. If anyone, is listening and feeling like, gosh, I really resonate with this, reach out to me and we'll just chat and see where it goes.
Yeah, you're so right that first step of reaching out is always the hardest one. Yeah. But that, brings us full circle back to the idea that we really weren't meant to address all of this by ourselves in isolation. And there's no shame in this, right? There's no shame. If you are a parent who's listening to this podcast and listening to the conversation that Marissa and I are having, and you're feeling like you have somehow failed because you're in chronic stress, or you've reached the point of burnout and you've gotten reactive and you snapped at your husband or your partner, you've yelled at your kids because of that reactivity, there's zero shame. And I know in my work, and I know, Marissa, this is true for you too, that when someone shows up at your figurative door, right, we're not going to be like, what were you thinking?
Yeah,
right.
No, absolutely. And I often say is like, you did not fail. The system failed you, but that doesn't mean you have to be stuck here. There are tools, there are strategies to get unstuck. And not only once you get unstuck, you use the same tools and strategies not to go back to that place. Yeah.
Oh, such a good conversation, and so important, I think, for all of us. It feels really timely as we, come in here to the end of the year, which can also be a really stressful
a holiday
time.
Hustle.
Yep. Yep. But, also as a way of thinking about, parents, like, what do you want for yourselves in 2025? Marissa, I'm so grateful to you for the work that you're doing and for sharing your wisdom with us today. We will make sure that all the ways to find you are in our show notes for anybody that would like to reach out. And thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. This has been a great conversation. I've loved it.
All right, parents. If that resonated with you as much as I hope that it did, if it felt so relevant, you're not alone. You're not alone. It certainly resonated with me. And like I said in the introduction to this, Marissa and I are speaking the same language, right? Maybe different analogies, but we are talking about, in many ways, similar issues, which is the importance of you as a parent taking care of yourself so that you can show up better for yourself, for your partner if you have one, for your children, for your coworkers, your employees, your boss, right? We show up so much better in all of those spaces when we take care of ourselves. And, Marissa and I share that view that we were never meant to do this alone. So if you are struggling, Marissa is available to help you. I am available to help you. But I think the most important thing that really, needs to rise to the level or to the top here, needs to percolate to the surface, is the idea that you can't sort of muscle your way out of this. You can't and shouldn't expect yourself to figure it all out by yourself. Sometimes we need support. And fortunately, there's plenty of it for the taking. So reach out to Marissa, reach out to me, get some support. And, as you are headed into the holiday season here and the new year, decide what kind of year do you want to have in 2025. On that note, I will leave you there and I will see you next week. Cheers, everybody.